At 14:45 local time on June 27, 2025, the pilot of a Ukrainian MiG-29 from the 40th Tactical Aviation Brigade yanked the stick hard left as his cockpit suddenly lit up in amber voltage warnings. Up until that moment, the flight had been almost boring, just another long ingress across featureless farmland on the way to a high-risk strike. Then, in the space of seconds, everything changed. His radar warning receiver began to scream as an S-300 acquisition radar locked on from nearly 100 kilometers away. The shrill tone was unmistakable. He had been painted, and the clock had started. The pilot shoved the MiG into a low dive, dropping to 500 feet to hug the terrain. At that altitude, radar beams struggled to follow him, but the danger was that every bump, every power line, every uncharted ridge became an instant death sentence. Meanwhile, his weapons interface was still crawling through a checklist that should have taken 30 seconds but was already dragging past 2 minutes. Each of the 4 GBU-39 small-diameter bombs under his wings needed to handshake with the jury-rig system, align its inertial navigation unit, and lock onto satellites through interference. The seconds dragged on like hours. At 14:48, the panel finally went green across all 4 stations. Relief lasted only a heartbeat. His iPad, strapped to the cockpit, flashed the target coordinates, a Russian drone factory more than 350 kilometers inside occupied territory. The sprawling facility was churning out 40 Shahed 136 drones every week, the very weapons that had been raining down on Ukrainian power plants and apartment blocks. Protecting it was a Kushika 4 electronic warfare truck, an ugly box on wheels capable of blasting 500 watts of GPS jamming across the L-band spectrum. He checked his fuel readout. 2,100 kilograms left. Enough for ingress, release, and exactly 18 minutes inside contested skies before bingo fuel forced him to turn back. That was the razor's edge this mission balanced on. To make matters worse, a new set of tones screamed in his headset, an SA-15 search radar sweeping from the southeast, hunting low flyers exactly like him. In less than 6 minutes, he would need to climb to 15,000 feet to loft his weapons. That climb would make him visible to every air defense system for hundreds of kilometers. The MiG's twin RD-33s groaned as he throttled forward. He felt the rumble through his spine as the aircraft strained against improvised wiring and overtaxed pylons, each bomb sucking 32 amps through connections designed for 20. Somewhere between American electronics and Soviet airframe, battlefield engineering was holding the whole thing together with little more than stubbornness and wire splices. It wasn't supposed to work, but tonight it had to. By 14:51, the fighter knifed across the invisible boundary of the contested zone. Every threat receiver lit up like a Christmas tree, S-400s from Melitopol searching, SA-15s maneuvering, and broad waves of static washing across his GPS frequencies. For the pilot, it meant one thing. He was now deep inside the most dangerous air defense grid outside of Moscow. And in just 19 minutes, he would find out if 4 bombs bolted to a MiG-29 with salvage tank parts could punch a hole through it. At 15:15 local time, the MiG-29 banked right and slid into the narrow corridor Ukrainian intelligence had mapped weeks before. On his tactical display, 2 overlapping arcs of death flickered, one from the western S-300 battery, the other from the eastern SA-15 patrol. Between them was an 8-kilometer sliver of airspace, barely a finger width on the screen, where no radar could see him. The gap wasn't some miracle of strategy, it was simple physics. The Earth's curvature blocked the S-400 radars from seeing anything below 800 feet at this distance, while the S-300 batteries were angled skyward to catch bombers, not treetop skimmers. For anyone reckless enough to risk it, the valley between the ridgelines became a temporary blind spot. Flying through it was another matter. A drift of just 2 kilometers left and the MiG would light up on S-300 scopes. 3 kilometers right, and he'd fall straight into the engagement envelope of an SA-15 patrol route. The pilot trimmed the stick with millimeter precision, watching his altimeter hover at 450 feet, his knees brushing against the stick as he tried to stay steady through turbulence. Each gust threatened to push him into certain death. At 15:18, the radar warning receiver pulsed with new energy. A mobile SA-15 had stopped moving. That detail chilled him more than the shrill alarm. The system's crew must have suspected the coverage gap and parked in ambush. Moments later, their 9S-36 search radar came alive, beams crawling across the terrain like invisible fingers. He shoved the MiG even lower, down to 400 feet, the exhaust plumes flattening grass along a dry riverbed. Ahead, power lines appeared, barely visible against the haze. They hadn't been marked on the outdated satellite imagery. He rolled slightly, missing them by meters, sweat running down his helmet liner. 4 minutes later, the mission timer ticked to 1522. It was time to climb. The bombs needed altitude, 15,000 feet, to unfold their wings and glide the required 90 kilometers to target. Any lower and they'd fall short, wasted. He eased back on the stick and initiated a 4G climb. The MiG's nose punched through thin haze, the altimeter winding upward. And then the storm began. His radar warning receiver lit up like a funeral pyre. Multiple fire control radars snapped to him in an instant. The S-400's massive gravestone radar locked on with 350 watts of directed energy, so strong it physically heated the MiG's radome. He felt like an insect trapped under a magnifying glass. He had exactly 90 seconds before he would be inside their engagement envelope, where a 48 N-6E missile could chase him down in under half a minute. 90 seconds, that was the entire margin for error in this mission. But the Ukrainian strike wasn't designed to rely on luck. 45 minutes earlier, Su-24s had screamed low over Tomak, releasing AGM-88 HARM missiles at Russian radars. Those radars had gone dark, but everyone knew they would be back online soon. Electronic warfare units meanwhile flooded the spectrum with fake radar returns, showing an entire strike package heading in from the northwest. To the defenders it looked like the real threat. The lone MiG-29 they actually needed to stop was sliding in from an entirely different vector. Every piece of the mission had been choreographed to deliver this sliver of opportunity, a 90-second window where deception, timing, and brute courage would decide everything. At 15:22 and 40 seconds, the MiG leveled at 15,000 feet. His fuel readout was brutal, 12 minutes left for the return trip, no margin for mistakes. The bomb indicators blinked green. The GBU-39s had completed their final system checks, each receiver clinging to 5 GPS satellites despite the static roaring across every channel. Position accuracy, 3 meters. Good enough to thread a needle. But downrange, the Kushika-4 electronic warfare vehicle had been blasting pure noise into the sky for 10 minutes. Its 500-watt transmitters poured interference across the L1 and L2 bands, flooding the air with false signals. Any ordinary GPS-guided weapon would have been blinded. For the Ukrainians, that meant betting the mission on whether American engineers had truly hardened their bombs against the best jammers Moscow could throw. The pilot steadied his breathing. His SPO-15 screamed, painting an orchestra of lock tones in his headset. The S-400's gravestone radar surged, SA-15s tracked from the flanks, and the Kushika jamming distorted his own displays. He had 60 seconds to act. He reached for the release. At 15:28, his thumb pressed the pickle switch. The MiG lurched upward as 250 pounds of steel and electronics dropped free from the starboard pylon. The first bomb's GPS receiver instantly detected the jamming storm, its signal-to-noise ratios plummeting to useless levels. Within 0.2 of a second, the weapon's guidance brain did exactly what it was designed to do. It ignored the noise, transitioned to inertial navigation, and kept flying. The jammers had just defeated themselves. 6 seconds later, the second bomb fell from the port wing, then the third from centerline, then the fourth. Each weapon extended its stubby wings exactly 2.7 seconds after release, shifting from dumb iron to precision gliders with a lift-to-drag ratio that rivaled a sailplane. They banked into programmed courses, their tiny actuators trimming fins to send them along 4 separate approach vectors. If Russian point defense tried to swat them down, no single system could catch them all. The pilot inverted and yanked the stick, pulling 5GS into a dive back toward the ground. The MiG roared downward, pressing him into his seat as he escaped the altitude bubble. His threat receiver howled. The SA-15s had switched from search to track, their operators finally realizing what he'd done. At 15:29 and 15 seconds, the nearest battery launched 2 9M9 missiles. Twin streaks of fire arced skyward, hunting his position. But their intercept equations were flawed before they even left the rails. The MiG would vanish behind terrain masking in under 45 seconds, long before the missiles could close the gap. Behind him, 4 gliding bombs sailed silently through contested airspace at 180 meters per second. Each computer compared accelerometer readings against stored waypoints, adjusting 20 times every second. When a thin crack of GPS punched through the jamming cloud at 15:31, the weapons instantly updated their positions. Their error margin, under 8 meters. The Kushika operators saw nothing, only the static they themselves were blasting across the sky. For the first time since the mission began, the pilot let himself believe, this just might work. At 15:32 and 44 seconds, the first GBU-39 locked onto its target. Its uncooled infrared seeker scanned ahead, matching the heat pattern of a corrugated metal roof against pre-loaded imagery. The software registered a 94% match, the drone assembly hall. The bomb flexed its tail fins, adjusting its dive angle to 68 degrees, the sweet spot for maximum penetration against light industrial roofs. Moments later, it slammed into the structure, detonating its 37 kilograms of explosive with surgical precision. The blast tore through the assembly lines where fuselages of Shahed 130 SAXS lay in neat rows, reducing them to twisted aluminum in seconds. 28 seconds later, the second bomb arrived. Its target was the electronics workshop, a smaller building crammed with benches covered in circuit boards, processors, and Iranian-designed autopilot modules. Without those guidance brains, the drones were nothing but expensive model planes. The weapon punched cleanly through the roof and detonated inside, the shockwave annihilating delicate electronics in every direction. Workstations vaporized, racks of laptops blew apart, and a chain reaction of sparks and fire consumed what hadn't been shattered outright. At 15:33 and 41 seconds, the third bomb struck the warehouse. Inside, Ukrainian intelligence had counted up to 20 completed Shahed drones, each one already loaded with 40 kilograms of explosives. The detonation triggered a hellish chain reaction. The warehouse became a volcano, the air itself igniting as stacked munitions cooked off in a rolling fireball. A shockwave ripped outward, flattening maintenance sheds and shredding fuel tanks in a thunderclap that echoed for miles. The secondary explosion was so violent it lifted the roof clean off, flipping it into a nearby parking lot like a toy. The fourth GBU-39 arrived 31 seconds later, slamming into what remained of the logistics hub. Fuel drums, spare wings, engine casings, all of it went up at once. The blast double-tapped the target, ensuring that not only the current stock but also the supply chain that fed it ceased to exist. Smoke plumes climbed 3,000 feet into the air, mushrooming outwards as ammunition and fuel detonated in a rolling cascade. For the Russian defenders, it was already too late. The Kushika, 4 operators finally realized what had happened, but their equipment told them nothing useful. Their 500-watt storm of jamming had done exactly what it was designed to do, obliterate GPS reception, yet the bombs had ignored the interference and flown as though the jammers didn't exist. The men inside the EW truck could only listen to the shockwaves rolling across the plain, each blast punctuated by the dull thud of their own failure. On the ground, panicked troops scrambled to fire man-portable air defenses, but by then the weapons were long gone. The bombs had arrived in carefully staggered intervals, overwhelming point defense radars with multiple vectors and forcing operators to pick targets they couldn't track in time. By the time the first interceptors were fired, the targets had already detonated. Back in the MiG, the pilot stole a glance over his shoulder. In the distance, the horizon bloomed with thick black smoke rising like a column of victory. For a brief, dangerous second, he let himself feel relief that 4 jury-rigged weapons strapped to an aging Soviet airframe had done the impossible. Relief that a factory producing dozens of drones a week had just been turned into ash and craters. Relief that maybe, just maybe, fewer Ukrainian civilians would die in their beds tonight. But relief didn't mean survival. His SPO-15 was still screaming. Russian defenses weren't done with him yet. At 15:34 local time, the MiG leveled at 400 feet, hugging the earth as though it could hide inside it. His fuel gauge blinked red, just 750 kilograms left. 12 minutes of flight time, no more. Behind him, the drone factory was now a cauldron of fire and secondary detonations. Plumes of oily smoke clawed skyward, each column proof that the mission had worked. But survival was still uncertain. The radar warning receiver shrieked again. Multiple SA-15 batteries had locked on, their radars chasing his fading heat signature. At 15:35, 29M9 missiles arced upward, accelerating past Mach 2.8 in seconds. Their guidance computers tracked his vector relentlessly, but physics was on his side. At treetop altitude, the MiG would vanish behind ridgelines and valleys in under 45 seconds. By the time the missiles closed, their seekers would lose him in ground clutter. The pilot shoved the stick forward, racing into a river valley that offered natural masking. His threat display flickered, and then the lock tones cut out. 30 seconds later, the missiles self-destructed harmlessly in the distance. But the Russians weren't finished. Over comms intercept, Ukrainian intelligence later confirmed that 2 Su-35s had been vectored from Barents to intercept. Their mission, cut off his escape before he reached the border. The flankers were fast, Mach 2 fast, but geometry was against them. They needed 8 minutes to reach his projected path. By then, the MiG would be 75 kilometers closer to friendly skies. Their S-77 missiles had excellent range, but they weren't magic. No radar could reliably pick out a target screaming at 400 feet through valleys and clutter. If he climbed, he would die. If he stayed low, he had a chance. At 15:38, he crossed the Malakna River, its winding waters carving deep canyons that blocked line of sight. This was the invisible frontier. Beyond it, Russian radar coverage collapsed under the weight of terrain. The SA-15s lost him entirely, their missiles never reacquiring a lock. The Su-35s pushed closer, but their fuel states were critical. With each minute of afterburner, their range shrank. They were forced to break off before they could even light him up. By 1546, the MiG crossed back into Ukrainian-controlled airspace. His gauges were brutally honest, 300 kilograms of fuel left. Enough for one circuit around the airfield and nothing more. He brought the fighter down hard, tires screeching against concrete, the jet rolling to a stop with fumes in the tanks. On the ground, technicians swarmed the battered airframe, unstrapping the improvised pylons and peeling scorched wiring from the fuselage. The mission data was downloaded immediately. Post-strike analysis confirmed what the pilot had only glimpsed. All 4 GBU-39s had struck within 12 meters of their intended targets, despite continuous GPS jamming. The Kushika-4 system had worked exactly as designed, and yet it had failed completely. The Russian defenders would learn the same lesson the world was now witnessing, that brute force jamming could not stop weapons engineered with decades of Russian doctrine in mind. Ukrainian ingenuity had married a 40-year-old Soviet jet to 21st-century American precision bombs, and together they had ripped the heart out of a factory responsible for hundreds of drones. For the pilot, there was no celebration. He climbed down from the ladder, legs trembling from adrenaline, helmet under his arm. He had flown into the teeth of the most advanced air defense network outside Moscow and come back alive. Behind him, smoke still curled in the evening sky to the east. Somewhere inside that haze, the wreckage of Shahed drones burned. And for the first time in months, Ukrainian cities would have one less night to fear them. The mission wasn't just survival. It was proof. Proof that desperate creativity, married to precision and courage, could bend even the most sophisticated defenses to breaking.